Minorities Meet Bamboo Ceiling. That's tonight's lecture's name. So this is part of our Asian American and Pacific Islander Month celebrations. My name is Sofia Gutierrez. I'm the current secretary for NOMAS, as well as your moderator for tonight's event. So this lecture is being recorded. We would love if you guys could have your cameras on and engage with the lecture. So on behalf of NOMAS, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. And before diving into our presenter, we'd like to quickly pass it over to NOMAS President Leah Margolis.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. So as Sofia just mentioned, I'm the current president of NOMAS, and I'm a current third year in architecture. I just wanted to thank you all for being here. I think that for me, as an Asian American and person of color, it has been very great that NOMAS has been able to celebrate AAPI month with our research and some more informal events this year, especially in the wake of all of the unfortunate anti-Asian American hate that has been going on in the country for a while. So I think it's really important that even during this time, we showcase and celebrate Asian American and Pacific Islander culture, heritage, and history. So I'm so happy that you guys are able to be here and that, yeah, we're able to have this event and we're all happy about it. But yeah, I will pass it back to Sofia.
Thanks, Leah. So now to present tonight's speaker. So we're excited to have Professor Yingyi Ma, Syracuse University's Asian and Asian American Studies professor, and she'll be discussing Asian Americans' role and challenges faced in higher education and the workplace. So she's currently a Provost Faculty Fellow on Internationalization at Syracuse University. And in 2019, she was selected as Public Intellectual Fellow at the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Professor Ma is a sociologist of education and migration. She's published extensively in the areas of education stratification, international student mobility, and higher education in Asia and America. Her new book, Ambitious and Anxious: How Chinese College Students Succeed and Struggle in American Higher Education, is published by Columbia University Press in 2020 and has been featured in various national and international media outlets, such as, but not limited to, Washington Post and Times Higher Education. The book has won Best Book Award, Higher Education Special Interest Group, Comparative and International Education Association 2021. She received her PhD in sociology from Johns Hopkins University in 2007. So quickly before we begin, feel free to ask any questions in the chat to spark discussion for later and also interact when Professor Ma indicates. However, if you want to verbally ask your questions, we ask that you wait until the end of the lecture during our Q&A session. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Professor Yingyi Ma to present her lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Leah and Sofia, for your wonderful introduction and a kind invitation. I'm very happy to give a talk to your great organization. So let me share my screen. By the way, I'm very passionate about the topic, and as a director of Asian American Studies program at Syracuse University, I always care deeply about our college students, their experiences on campuses, and more importantly, I think as a community, we're less concerned about what happened after college. That's why I want to talk about bamboo ceiling, which is really the kinds of glass ceiling, invisible barriers for labor market promotion issues facing Asian American community. So with that being said, I'd like to share my screen. So the title of my lecture today is Model Minorities Meeting the Bamboo Ceiling. All right, so I think this happens sometimes. I cannot scroll down, so I have to probably doing that again. All right, So here's my talk outline. So I want to start from some social facts, kind of establishing why Asian Americans are perceived or stereotyped as model minorities. There's some kinds of social facts I think we need to get straight. Also, bamboo ceiling, I think there are also very important social facts. And what is model minority and non-minority minority? So those are the two terms Asian Americans are oftentimes described by popular media as well as social scientists. So what are they, and what are the rationales behind those labels? And the third, I want to cover bamboo ceiling, which is exactly the kinds of glass ceiling facing Asian American community. And what are the explanations that social scientists put forward to understand bamboo ceiling? And most importantly, of course, I think we want to look ahead and see how we can improve this kind of situation. So what are the solutions? And I'll be more than happy to engage with the audience with regards to every part of the section of my talk. So to start, some basic facts. Let me move it here so that we can see. So first, Asian Americans are the fastest growing minority group in the American higher education since 1980s, and you're going to see some figures in a few moments, and represented by several ethnic groups. As a result, Asian Americans have the highest college enrollment and attainment rate among all Americans. So this is not just compared to other minorities. And most conspicuously, I think that's oftentimes aroused a lot of media attention, is Asian Americans are actually overrepresented in selective colleges in relation to their share in the general population, as well as college-going population. So, and this is actually most prominent in Ivy Leagues. So Asian Americans are hovering around like 20% of Ivy League population. So those are the facts. And compared to the college-going population and what is represented, it is a large general population growth in contemporary Asian America, which is really characterized by the dramatic increase in Asian immigration. And when we're talking about contemporary Asian American community, which is really after 1970s. So as you can see, the general population in 1970s is only 0.7% of US population are Asian American community. And that percentage steadily increased, and most recent census 2010, we have 5.7%. And you can just imagine 2020 census, the Asian American community has inched over 6% now. So right now, Asian Americans are the fastest growing population in the United States, exceeding Latinos. And most importantly, I think relevant to our community, to our audience today, is this phenomenon of college education. So this is data by a recent article published in Ethnic and Racial Studies by Van Tran, Jennifer Lee, and Tiffany Huang, revisiting the Asian second generation advantage. So social scientists seem to identify there is a second generation advantage, especially with regards to education. And in this talk, you're going to see that I'm going to cover both higher education and the labor market. So in higher education, we have seen a pretty solid pattern of especially second generation advantage. And we can see that this is actually going beyond second generation. While social scientists are fascinated by the second generation advantage because there is a pretty marked social mobility pattern here. So as you can see, this figure represents about 80% of Asian American population. So these are the 5 biggest ethnic groups: Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, and Korean. And so the bars represents the percentage of college graduate for these 5 ethnic groups. So we can see that the blue bar refers to Chinese population, and the blue bar refers to the first generation. So the first cluster refers to Chinese, and the orange bar refers to the second generation, and the gray bar refers to so-called non-migrant. So I think the non-migrant is a little bit vague here, actually referring to their co-ethnics back in their home countries. So in other words, for example, for Chinese, the blue bar represents the first generation, 55% of first generation Chinese Americans in the United States having college degrees and above. So that really means more than one in half, right? And the orange bar refers to 75%. So the second generation college graduates percentage is even higher, 3/4, which is amazing. But when you're looking at the gray bar, which is only 3.6%, that number refers to the percentage of college graduates in China. So in their home country, there is only less than 4% of the Chinese in China with college degrees and above. So what does that really mean? That really means that Chinese Americans, especially for first generation Chinese immigrants in the United States, they're extremely positively selected. So social scientists use hyper-selectivity to refer to that kind of striking positive selection. So hyperselectivity refers to that they're not only positively selected, as you can see, there is a horizontal line refers to the percentage of college graduates for Blacks, as well as the blue horizontal line refers to whites. So for Chinese Americans, first generation, they're not only the percentage of college graduates, they're not only higher than Blacks, they're actually higher than whites. So, so this refers to the hyperselectivity of Asian Americans. And you can see that for Indians, their first generation college graduates has even a higher percentage than Chinese Americans. And Filipino has a similar kinds of a pattern for Chinese, but their second generation do not really have as high college attainment compared to Chinese. So in other words, for Chinese Americans, the second generation mobility is pretty salient. Filipino has not really achieved that. But back in Philippines, their college educated population is much higher than both China and India, represented by the gray bar. All right, so moving on to Vietnamese. So Vietnamese actually is a very interesting community. When you're looking at the first generation, only 26% of first generation Vietnamese Americans having college degree and above. This is lower than non-Hispanic white, but higher than non-Hispanics Blacks. But when it comes to the second generation, they have a huge upward social mobility. 62% of second generation and above of Vietnamese have college degree and above. Okay, and but in their home country, Vietnam, there is only 6.7% of Vietnamese back in their home country have college degree and above. So similar patterns. I think Koreans are very much similar to Chinese in terms of their first generation and second generation college degrees and above. So what this data really shows is, in general, so these 5 groups represents a large majority of Asian American population. And what this pattern really presents is they're hyper-selected. Okay, so now the question is why? And it has to understand this, we have to really go back to to go back to immigration history and immigration policy here. But the other side that I don't really have data, the figure to show you is that Asian Americans are actually concentrated in both high end and low end of the population distribution. So it is actually very interesting. They're not sort of randomly distributed compared to the general American population. Because of the highly selected immigration trajectory, that Asian Americans have a higher poverty rate. So nationwide, 12.3% of Asian Americans fall under poverty line compared with 9.8% of non-Hispanic whites. And counting cost of living, because we know that Asian Americans are more likely to live in the most expensive cities in America, such as New York, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. So the actual poverty rate is at least 2.5% higher. So in other words, close to 15% of poverty rate. So how can we really understand this phenomenon of, on one hand, there is this hyper-selectivity, this 55%, 70% of Chinese and Indians having college degree and above. On the other hand, there is a much higher poverty rate compared to non-Hispanic whites. So then we have to really understand the driving forces for contemporary Asian immigration. So after 1965, we know that America has enacted Immigration and Nationality Act that has removed national origin systems, which is highly discriminatory, starting from 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act. And during the Civil Rights era, that kind of a highly discriminatory national origin immigration policy was replaced with preference system to unite immigrants of family-based family reunification systems. At the same time, the policies are trying to attract skilled workers. So since 1965, we have a lot of extremely well-educated immigrants from all over the world, but most prominently from Asia, from China, from India, a lot of scientists, a lot of engineers, a lot of medical workers, doctors, nurses, and that really shaped the contemporary Asian American community. So other than 1965 Immigration and Nationality Act, the other very important act is 1980 Refugee Act. So that act directly brought a lot of refugees from Southeastern Asian societies, such as Cambodian, Vietnam, Laos, and Hmong. That's actually contributed to a lot of Southeastern Asian American communities in the United States. And that is why you see that a lot of Southeastern Asian communities, including Cambodians, Laos, and Hmongs, and Vietnamese, they have first generation, very different socioeconomic demographic profile, from education to occupation to income. Okay, so that's the other side. That's sort of concentrated to the lower end, lower skilled of demographic distribution. And then followed by 1990 Immigration Act. That act, again, draws upon very highly skilled technical scientists, engineers. So as we can see, without really knowing the history of immigration policies, we are very easily misled by what we see from the surface, that we see a lot of so many Chinese scientists, Indian doctors, Filipino nurses, and those are really feeding into all those kinds of stereotypes without really understanding the immigration history and what really drives towards those kinds of occupational niches. That's what sociologists are calling them. All right, so all of that, the driving forces for contemporary Asian American immigration and helping to formulate Asian American communities really contribute to the model minority thesis here. So here I want to share with you a couple pictures in the popular media. This image of Asian Americans as a successful minority has remained a very important conceptual force in the popular press. First really started in 1966, New York Times Magazine, titled "Success Story, Japanese American Style." So I would really date this story, this media narrative, as the first ever model minority sort of trope. And so this magazine cover by Times, which is in August 1987, you can see on the magazine cover, the title is "Those Asian American Whiz Kids." I think those narratives and tropes are still very much pervasive in 21st century American schools, that consider a lot of American teachers would just call Asian American kids as whiz kids. They're good at math. They're just very smart. All those kinds of stereotypes, although positive, and we're going to show you how these are actually helping them to some extent, Asian American students and younger generation, to some extent on the other side, also hurting them when it comes to bamboo ceiling. So the model minority thesis has been very much criticized by social scientists, and but not so much in the popular media. And the popular media continue to churn out all those kinds of stories and headlines about the model minorities, how Asian Americans are so successful. And those articles really marked a significant turning point in the public's perception of Asian American. And the damaging not only is for the other side of Asian American community, as I said, having this higher poverty rate, they're over concentrated at both ends of the population distribution. At the same time, it is very damaging for interracial relations. Asian American success are really used as a wedge issue, constituted a direct critique of other minorities who sought relief through federally supported social programs. So basically, authorities, and oftentimes represented by white people, looking at other minorities, saying that, look at Asian Americans and how successful they are. If they can make it, you can make it. So those wedge issues are really driving and Asian Americans apart from other minorities and making interracial solidarity very challenging, and sometimes making Asian Americans, especially second generation, have a very hard time in fitting into the social fabric of American life. So we know that there is strong evidence to defy model minority thesis. Socioeconomic indicators lower than whites, represented by the median individual income is actually lower than whites, even though the household income is higher than whites. Especially taking into account of their education, their returns to education is lower than whites. And we're going to show you by the bamboo ceiling, their representation at the managerial level is exceedingly low. So we talk about poverty rate, 12.3% is higher than whites as well. So the other very important evidence that defy model minority myth is the racial subordination of Asian Americans, oftentimes as perpetual foreigners. So no matter how much time Asian Americans are living, even born in the United States, third generation, fourth generation, they're still perceived as a foreigner, sort of this perpetual foreigner label attached to Asian Americans. So a lot of people, a big part of model minority thesis is this this perception that Asian Americans are highly successful in education is because Asian American families very much value education. And I think, social scientists have not really take issue with that. They do have a lot of empirical evidence showing that Asian Americans value education. Asian Americans are very much invested in their children's education across the board, not just for college educated families, but also for working class families. And the outcome is pretty remarkable, as we can see that their second generation college graduation rate is very high, especially for people from working class families. But I today I want to share with you a very important theory, which is called relative functionalism, which is the perceived limitations in mobility in non-educational endeavors increase the relative function or value of education as a means towards success. So because in the popular culture, to understand Asian American value in education, oftentimes using cultural explanation. So, they use, people oftentimes understand these kinds of value from Asian American cultures, such as Chinese culture, such as Indian culture, even going back to Confucian culture, even though not all Asian Americans share Confucianism background, only China, Korea, and Japan share similar kinds of cultural heritage of Confucianism. Indians don't, but Confucianism do have this kind of a premium on education. They have this kind of doctrine of putting a lot of emphasis on education. What I want to share with you is the theory of relative functionalism is really focusing on sort of going beyond cultural explanation, focusing on the perceived limitations in mobility in non-educational endeavors. Sort of really trying to understand from the opportunity structure that, trying to understand that because Asian Americans have challenges in mobilities in other areas that do not really so much depend on education. Therefore, that really increase their relative function or relative returns to education. That is why they value education very much. So here at this point, I just want to pause and ask you to think about the examples for non-educational types of endeavors so that we can think about how in those kinds of non-educational types of endeavors, how Asian Americans are represented and why Asian Americans perceive they have difficulties in those non-educational sort of are there limitations in achieving in those areas? If so, why so? Okay, so I want to stop sharing, even though I have additional materials, especially for bamboo ceilings. And I want to see, people please type in the chat box. And what are the examples of non-educational endeavors or arenas where people's success do not so much depend on education or especially exceedingly high level of education? We all know that doctors, of course, need very much a high level of education, right? Okay. So I saw people are typing in the box. That's actually what I love about Zoom, what I love about virtual talk, right? People can participate. And I know that some people actually prefer to type. When I was, teaching in classroom, when I asked people to raise hand, and then when I asked people to type in chat box, I saw the same students would not really raise hand in classroom, but would very much participate in the chat box, which is pretty impressive. All right, so I saw people giving various kinds of examples, TV shows, pop music, movie stars. That's entertainment industry, right? And yes, there's little representation of Asians in American media, TV, movies, film industry. Entrepreneurship, yes, you don't really need, at least technically, you don't really need a college education to start the business. Yes, Asian immigrant enclaves in the US. Actually, Korean Americans have the highest entrepreneurship rate. That's why you see so many small business stores opened by Koreans and Indians as well. And a lot of, there is a book by Pangwon Dingra, really focusing on those motels. Do you know that most of the motels in America owned by Indian Americans? And those Indian Americans, they usually do not have the kind of college education we saw in the hyper-selectivity bars, even though close to 80% of first-generation Indian Americans have college degrees and above. That is, again, because of our immigration policies. At my hometown here at Syracuse, a lot of our doctors are Indians, close to 40%, I'm told. That's just amazing. Syracuse doctors, 40% of them are Indians, and oftentimes they're first generation. So great. Sports. Sports definitely do not really require a lot of definitely advanced education to play basketball, right? Or football. What else? Let's see. So, so far I've collected examples of entertainment, entrepreneurship, sports, and the big part you have not really. Yes, thank you so much. Yutaka, right? Not too many politicians. Yes. How many senators we have? 100, right? Test my political science 101. 100 senators. How many Asian Americans? 2. That's 2%. I don't know what about Congress. But senators, that's 2%. And one is from Hawaii. I don't blame that. So politics is a huge, big arena that Asian Americans are underrepresented. Okay, so I think we probably covered every example I can think about. Thank you so much. Yes, they require education, but they don't really require necessarily a graduate school education or a very selective education. Okay, and now let's think about the limitations in those areas. Why Asian Americans? What kind of limitations Asian Americans have in entertainment? What kind of limitations Asian Americans have in business, in entrepreneurship? What kind of limitations Asian Americans have in politics? If you can type that. You know, sociologists are often talk about social capital, cultural capital, right? So social capital refers to social connections, who you know. Cultural capital is about the knowledge, the comfort level, the familiarity with American pop culture. So that's pretty much well explained. Like you can just well imagine the first generation immigrants are just hard to break into pop culture and becoming actresses and becoming famous in entertainment, right? So but I am first generation Chinese American, and I can be a professor because I after I get my PhD, I don't really need to know much about popular culture to teach in the American classroom, right? So that credential actually protect immigrants. So are doctors, so are scientists, engineers, because those knowledge is transferable, right? 1 + 1 is equal to 2. Nobody will argue with you about that. And so that I saw people type in the chat box, not loud, aggressive, tough enough. And this is actually very much a part of cultural explanations for the bamboo ceiling. We're gonna just get into that in a moment. But thank you so much. This is actually exactly what I want to discuss with you in terms of how to really understand Asian Americans' value on education. And so much model minority myth or so much model minority understanding on this is really focusing on culture, is focusing on they're just very into education, they just value education. And I hope that after today's lecture you can walk away with a more complicated understanding. Culture is relevant, but culture is not entire explanation. Relative functionalism refers to more of a structural opportunities, other non-educational arenas that Asian Americans perceive that they have a challenging time. So in other words, their valuing of education, and actually more specifically, we don't really have much time to talk about in my lecture. I would be happy to engage in Q&A, is Asian Americans are not just into education in general, they're actually very strategic in terms of the occupational choices in the fields they enter. That's actually my dissertation. I write my dissertation 15 years ago on college major choices, really focusing on how college major and fields of study serve as a horizontal sources of social inequality that Asian Americans very much strategically enter and choose certain fields such as STEM, such as medical fields, such as pharmacy. Those fields are highly credentialed so that they feel that they are less likely to be discriminated. Okay, or the barriers are just lower. They're less likely to depend on the cultural capital and social capital they see as an immigrant or second generation. They're just disadvantaged. All right, so let me continue share my screen. Thank you so much for a vibrant discussion on this issue here. So we covered relative functionalism, and it's important to understand Asian Americans' value of education. And we talk about model minority and how model minority thesis is problematic, is not covering a full spectrum of Asian American community, is driving the wedge against other minorities. And the other is this NMM status is actually another manifestation of Asian Americans' very awkward status in America, that this non-minority minority status. Asian Americans are often counted as non-minority, oftentimes non-underrepresented categories in higher education and workplace. They're the non-minority minority compared to Hispanics, African Americans, and Native Americans. They are oftentimes the forgotten minority in the DEI conversation. DEI refers to diversity, equity, and inclusion, and particularly glass ceiling conversations. So particularly in the conversation about invisible barriers to promotion, Asian Americans are the forgotten minorities. If you're looking at various reports about the DEI conversations, Asian Americans are oftentimes not even counted, they're not discussed, they're not included. And this is actually the thing that I want to really highlight in today's lecture, and I want to bring your attention to. And as a matter of fact, the data shows that glass ceiling is real facing Asian Americans. And actually, scholars describe this particular barriers facing Asian Americans as bamboo ceiling in workplace. So here is a couple of statistics here. Even in Silicon Valley, where about 30% of tech professionals in some companies are this number is even higher, are Asians. Asian Americans only account for only 12.5% of managers, So in other words, even though the pipeline for the managers are pretty high and well represented, the odds of being promoted is pretty low. 80% of tech bosses are Caucasian. Asian Americans constitute the largest minority group in major law firms. They have the lowest partner to associate ratio among all ethnic groups, including Blacks and Hispanics. So in other words, again, here is the issue of the pipeline is full, but the promotion ladder is just narrow. And so we talk about tech, law, and we're now in higher education. Among American college presidents, only 2% are Asians compared to 4% and 8% of Hispanics and Blacks separately. And this is considering that Asian American faculty members are much, much higher than other minorities, at least 10%. I need to get the latest data. The most recent I checked is 10%. So in other words, Asian Americans, like, the likelihood of Asian Americans being promoted in various settings are really lowest compared to all the minority groups. So here is a report written by Buck Gee, a former CEO of Adiyama Systems, and Denise Peck, former VP at Cisco Systems. They analyzing the national EEOC workforce data. And here is the findings. I quote, Asian American white-collar professionals are the least likely group to be promoted from individual contributor roles into management, less likely than any other race, including Blacks and Hispanics. And our analysis found that white professionals are about twice as likely to be promoted into management as their Asian American counterparts. Therefore, this is the bamboo ceiling is real. And we don't really talk about it because of model minority thesis or myth or stereotype, or because Asian Americans are not counted by institutions and organizations as underrepresented. Okay, so and the consequence of this kind of bamboo ceiling is most definitely talent loss. So here is a plugin. As Sofia just introduced me, I just published a book focusing on Chinese international students in America. And this book really covers a wide range of their experiences from academic and social. And one aspect I look at is their graduation plan. So some of them, there is a rising trend of Chinese international students returning to China, and some of them, of course, family is a major reason, but some of them did mention bamboo ceiling. Some international students chose to leave the U.S. because they're aware of the glass ceiling. They're aware that Asian Americans are not easily getting promoted as other groups. That's something we just went over. That's actually backed by data. And the other book that I want to share with you is actually just coming out. It's written by a sociologist, Leslie Wang from University of Massachusetts at Boston. It's her new book, Chasing the American Dream in China, Chinese Americans in the Ancestral Homeland, as you can see from the title. This is focusing on the second generation Chinese Americans return migration, and a big part is anti-Asian racism. So we know that this year and the last year, anti-Asian racism has received a lot of media attention, a lot of visibility. But before this pandemic, before these 2 years, anti-Asian racism was there and was always there. And so this book has actually dealt with some of the ramifications that the return migration of Asian Americans to their ancestral lands. So I think these are just the two books I want to share with you in relation to the consequence of bamboo ceiling. And most direct work addressing bamboo ceiling is by another sociologist. I'm very proud to be a sociologist because we are a group of scholars actually addressing this issue and producing the most amazing work at this point. Margaret Chin, who is at CUNY City University of New York at Hunter College. She just published a book. The title is Stuck, Why Asian Americans Don't Reach the Top of the Corporate Ladder. So her book is really focusing on corporate America. So I just talk about higher education. I don't really think her book has really dealt with higher education sector, but just corporate America. But this book is really the monograph addressing the issue of bamboo ceiling. Okay, and one of the major concept that Professor Chin has advanced is this Asian American playbook. Basically, this playbook is a kinds of rules practiced and taught within the family, across generations by Asian American parents, Asian American community leaders to their second generation, to their students, to their children. That is the rules how to succeed in America. The rules are very much like what we believe in terms of Asian American stereotypes: working hard, be quiet, lowering your head. Don't, as someone just type in the chat box, don't be loud, just be quiet and doing your work. So these playbook largely subscribe to the notion of meritocracy, or this notion of American dream. As long as you work hard, you show by your work, you're gonna be successful. And these kinds of playbook, as Professor Chin has argued, are working pretty well, only in school settings and as well as entry-level jobs in the labor market. So in other words, these set of rules are going to help indeed Asian American children. So these are not just those people from well-educated families, but even from working class families. That's why there is a big second generation mobility, as we can see from Vietnamese data, that they have a big mobility. But these gains are largely confined in educational attainment and entry-level jobs. Those gains are not translated to senior level positions. And according to Margaret, from the research she has done, the issue is about trust. Senior leadership do not really have the kind of trust they need to promote Asian Americans to the top level positions in corporate America. So, those top level positions are, for example, C-level, chief, CEOs, COOs, and CFOs, those kinds of chief positions. And for those C-level positions, the most important issue is trust. And Asian American communities cannot really win the trust of their managers and senior leadership. That's why they meet the bamboo ceiling. So this is what Professor Chin has advanced in her book. And I want to really address these explanations for bamboo ceiling from a broader perspective centered on both internal and external aspects. So the internal aspects really focusing on cultural dissonance. In other words, the discrepancy between the cultural backgrounds that Asian Americans are coming from and the American mainstream culture, in corporate world, in politics, in leadership in general, what is really needed. And the second is external to Asian American community, which is really about racial structure. So different cultural values, as someone just typed in the book, someone being, Asian Americans are not aggressive enough, they're not loud enough, they're quiet. So those are broadly the cultural dissonance. And Asian Americans are humble, they're self-effacing, and I think most recently you can see the speech delivered by the Asian American, the Korean woman who got the Best Supporting Actress. Look at the remarkable speech she has given. And that speech is very distinct, humble, self-effacing Asian culture, but she is successful. So she's, welcome. Those kind of speech is welcomed. But just think about those kinds of manners and values manifested in workplace. And that is not oftentimes going well in corporate America. So I just want to share with you the quotes. The Chinese say the loudest duck gets shot, but for Americans, it's a squeaky wheel gets the grease. So this is a really, we don't really negate cultural differences. And here is actually best represented by these kinds of quotes. There is pretty striking cultural differences. And sometimes Asian Americans believe that those cultural differences get in the way of their being promoted. But I want to warn you that I think the cultural dissonance explanation is pretty limited, in a sense that for some Asian Americans who are able to overcome cultural dissonance. So in other words, they try not to be quiet. They're very loud. They are aggressive. They are confident. How far can they go? Not so far. This is actually confirmed by a 2012 study of Jennifer Burdell and Jie Ming have found that East Asians with dominant and warm personalities, the kinds of values, the kinds of cultural attributes pretty consistent with white America they're not really as likable as white coworkers with the same kinds of personalities, or they're not as likable as non-dominant Asians. So in other words, stereotypes about Asian Americans, they're not only descriptive, they're also prescriptive. So in other words, even Asian Americans overcome the cultural dissonance. They adopt the values of corporate America. They're not really able to reap the benefits. That's what I'm saying. So therefore, I think this racial structure is deserving our attention. So here is a racial triangle theory put forward by Si Kim in 1999. Basically, he proposed that Asian Americans really stand in the middle of this racial structure of whites and blacks in terms of racial hierarchy. But another axis, which is foreigner and insider, Asian Americans are really the least in terms of perceived as this kind of perpetual foreigner attributes. Let me see my time here. Okay. So here is, based on this kind of racial structure theory, the article in 2015 actually conduct some real analysis using American Community Survey, looking at how Asian Americans are really perceived in American society. So you can see that some are very high, some are pretty low. I do actually wanted you to have some kinds of discussion. We probably don't have time at this point, but so let's just, so where are Asians rated high and low? Asians are really rated pretty high in terms of those kinds of hardworking family values, and they're rated at the top actually. So these are the aspects that there is a racial valorization going on. The fact that Asians are rated high suggests that Asian Americans are viewed as a model among minorities. So they're not just model minorities, they're really the model for all groups at the racial hierarchy in terms of family values, education values. But they experience a very high level of so-called civic ostracism. Asians are perceived to be in the low position on the racial hierarchy in terms of feeling thermometer. So, Others don't really feel warm towards Asian Americans. I think what Margaret Chin find the low trust issue is also this feelings thermometer, and they live, only 30% of Americans live in the same communities with Asian Americans, and the marriage wise, they're also rated pretty low. And they're also rated low in terms of patriotism. So all of that really shows that Asian Americans experience some kinds of civic ostracism. And so the problem of merit and meritocracy that Asian American playbook really subscribe to. So here I want to share with you a quote by Carable, studying this elite college admissions in terms of this proposition that the definition of merit is fluid and tends to reflect the values and interests of those who have the power to impose their particular cultural ideals. Okay, so this quote really shows that merit is very relative, and meritocracy has certain traps that Asian Americans are not very much aware. So I want to end by talking about the solutions, how Asian American communities and our social institutions can really address this issue of bamboo ceiling. Institutions need to take a systematic look at their promotion profiles, and Asian Americans need to be included. I think Asian American communities need to really make statements that we need to be included in the DEI conversation. We should not really be the forgotten minorities in the DEI conversation. And institutions really need to systematically institutionalize Asian American leadership as a goal of their development, as a development programs. For example, provide mentors and sponsors, just like they have done to other minorities and women. And I also want to talk about transformations in popular culture. The invisibility and marginalization of Asian Americans largely contribute to the lack of trust and the civic ostracism that Asian Americans have experienced in America. And that is very much contributing to the issue of likability and trust, and which ultimately really will address this issue of promotion and bamboo ceiling that Asian Americans are facing. So I think I have spoken for an hour, and I'll stop here addressing your questions. I saw there's a couple things in the chat, and I'll hand it over to Sofia. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor Ma. That was very informative. That was a great lecture. Thanks so much. So as Professor Ma mentioned, we would like to open it up to a Q&A session. So I saw there were a couple of things people would like to discuss in the chat. Please feel free to retype those questions if you want, or ask a new one. And also at this point, feel free to unmute and ask your question verbally. Actually, I would like to start it off, if no one minds. So as Leah mentioned in the chat, NOMAS has been doing some research on ethnic enclaves for Asian minority groups. And so I was wondering how different you think it is within Asian families living in ethnic enclaves and those not living in ethnic enclaves, as far as education as promotion and prioritized.
I want to address this issue from two aspects. First, Sofia, to address your questions, Asian Americans living in ethnic enclaves, like for example, Chinese Americans living in Chinatown, and they actually have experienced very fast mobility, especially for second generation. So in other words, if their parents if they're living in Chinatown, that often means their parents are working in Chinatown. That means their parents are not, they're not the majority of Asian Americans that we can see in the hyper-selectivity picture. Chinese Americans in New York City has a very high poverty rate, and a big part of those segments are actually those people who are working in Chinatown in the sewing factories and in restaurant waiting for tables. So, but their children have a very, very good mobility in terms of going to college. There is a book called Inheriting the City, that is not just focusing on Asian American, but focusing on second generation immigrants, children of immigrants in New York City. We know that New York City has a lot of children of immigrants. And what they have found is this so-called second generation advantage. So the second generation advantage is not just limited to Asian Americans. They have found the similar pattern taking place for Caribbean immigrants, for example, for Russian immigrants. So, but for Asian immigrants, the pattern is very strong that, those people, those children living in ethnic enclave, if they are able to go to college, oftentimes they are, actually, a big part going to CUNY. CUNY, Asian American population close to 50%. And they just hired Asian American president. That's the first time ever. CUNY right now has 2 Asian American college presidents. One is at Queens College. The other is at Baruch College. So, but just think about it. CUNY has historically have the highest percentage of students being Asian Americans, but not until 2020, their college presidents have never been Asian Americans. I'm so glad to see that Frank Wu has become a Queens College president, and I will have opportunity to interview him, I believe, in 2 weeks at Syracuse. So we have invited him to give a talk as a keynote speaker, and I will interview him. And so Frank Wu is the first Asian American college president for Queens College, and David Wu is the first Asian American college president for Baruch College. Okay, so a lot of, as you said, a lot of second generation children from ethnic enclaves, they going to college, and oftentimes they go to CUNY, one of those CUNY colleges. And once they go out to colleges, they are leaving ethnic enclaves. They're joining the mainstream economy, unlike their parents. So this is a perfect American dream story of pathways through education, their occupational attainment shift from the informal economy, ethnic enclaves, to mainstream economy. The other thing, Sophie, I want to address it to you is ethnic enclave can be also understood as ethnic business. Okay, so ethnic enclave is traditionally understood, still largely so, as Chinatown, Koreatown, and so on and so forth. But ethnic enclave at the higher end could be understood as ethnic business. And that's where you can also see a lot of bamboo ceilings going on. So if you go to Silicon Valley, and if you look at Asian CEO, first of all, Asian CEOs are actually more than Black CEOs or Latino CEOs, but their odds of becoming CEO is pretty low because the pipeline is pretty strong. But more importantly, Asian CEOs are very, very less likely to happen in big corporations. So for those Asian CEOs, they're more likely to be their own ethnic business. So what does that really tell? That is a biggest testimony to the argument that some people are saying that, oh, you don't really see a lot of Asian Americans rising to the top because they don't really have leadership ambitions. They don't really want to be CEOs. They just want to be the mid-level engineers, scientists, and some are. I've known some friends, in college, they say that I don't really want to get promoted and get into administration. I don't want to get into politics. I just want to do my research. Of course, some people are like that. And what I'm saying is, there are whites like that, there are blacks like that, right? You cannot really just saying that all Asians are like that. So I think Asians some Asian Americans are very ambitious, and their ambitions meet roadblocks in major corporations. They're getting stuck, as Margaret Chen's book title shows. And that's why they get out of the big corporations. They start their own business. That's why you see there are so many ethnic business, tech companies, startups actually started by immigrants, because they don't really want to, they don't really have those kinds of social, cultural, and cultural capital to figure out the ropes of getting promoted. So that's another types of ethnic enclave that I want to bring your attention. I don't really think a lot of people would view that as ethnic enclave. It is. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that answer. Yeah, we hadn't really considered that in discussing ethnic enclaves because, you know, from an architecture perspective, I think we think of a lot of, you know, spatial, you know, neighborhood and urban environments, but we don't think as much about, you know, businesses and that type of ethnic enclave. So thank you so much for that informative answer. If anyone else has questions, feel free to ask, unmute, type in the chat.
Thank you, of course, for a very incredible talk. I, as someone who just recently took my first Asian American Studies course, as you know, in last semester, it was really great to learn officially and formally the history of many types of Asian Americans in the U.S. and how all of that began, even with I'm forgetting the names of things now, but just a lot of the first Chinese Americans came, in I believe it's the 1800s. I mean, even longer ago than I had realized, for example. There's a lot to be learned in that history.
Yeah, they were building railroads.
Right.
Yeah.
Oh, the coolie trade. That's it.
Yeah.
But I was just wondering, one of the things that I learned about in Professor, I guess we just called him RJ, but in RJ's course was about how, a lot of the model minority myth could have come from the intelligence tests that they gave to immigrants, where they only let the most perceived as intelligence, of course, is, subjective, but the intelligent immigrants in. So that could have started the whole, even back then, the minority myth. So I was just wondering what you thought about that.
I think, it certainly has some historical roots. But, the reason that I want to focus today on contemporary Asian American community, because of the contemporary immigration policies are very different from, 1900, and contemporary immigration policies brought special selected, sociologists call that hyper-selected immigrants to America. So that even make the model minority myth even more prominent, because you brought many scientists and engineers and medical doctors here, and people don't really know about the history, don't really know about the policy, would just, think about, if you only know 2 or 3 Chinese or 2 or 3 Indians, they're all doctors or scientists, and people would just draw the conclusion saying that Chinese and Indians are just smart, they're very intelligent. So those are the kinds of stereotypes that we're facing, and those are the positive stereotypes. But at the same time, we need to be aware that, because as it happens to all the stereotypes, it lacks nuance. It has the flip side, which is really do not understand the complexity of the community. As I just explained, the notion of merit and meritocracy is not just about, you're intelligent, you're smart. And of course, intelligent and smart are not the bad thing. But when people at the top are not people like you, they're not going to really rate intelligent and smart as important attributes to being a strong leader. They're gonna use they're gonna develop the kinds of rules that you don't really have. For example, aggressive. I don't just, even though you're smart, you're intelligent, I don't really feel I can trust you. Or even though you're extremely intelligent, I don't really think you can take the kinds of leadership positions that require decision making or taking risks, or those kinds of very elusive concepts or attributes that I simply don't really see that in you. So that is why it's very important to understand, this ideology of meritocracy is determined by people who are in power. And if people in power are not diverse and inclusive, no matter how you work hard and smart, you're not going to be in the league. That's what's lacking in Asian American playbook. That's what Professor Margaret Chin has really advanced in her book, trying to understand bamboo ceiling. So what really make Asian Americans successful in schools, what make Asian American playbook tick, is not going to tick anymore in the labor market, because their playbook doesn't really include those kinds of things that matter, that defined by people who are in power.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I feel like it's the opposite for a lot of other minority groups in America. Like for Black Americans and Hispanic and Latino Americans, we kind of have the, perception of being too loud and too aggressive and too all of those things. So it's really interesting how what's maybe seen as a positive stereotype for the mono minority, and to have having Asian Americans be perceived as very proper, very smart and quiet. It's the opposite for a lot of other minorities. So it's very interesting that you point that out. Sorry, Bilal, did you have something to say? I think you unmuted for a second.
I do have a lot to say. That's why I wanted to wait and let folks who might be able to get a word in first. So one, the stereotype working against you thing, this is actually rooted in the Europe's first racial problem was with Jews. And it's a very, very old racial problem that we don't think of as racial anymore because it's become seen as more religious and ethnic. But Jews were stereotyped as really good with money, and this worked against them in Europe. Coming into the United States, by that point, the stigma was there, so it didn't have to focus on the idea of the greedy Jew. The stigma remained, and so it's interesting, to follow these things in a comparative context. So that's one point. The other part of the comparative context is the bamboo ceiling. As you talked about it in more detail, and as you showed the graph where you essentially have Asian Americans as this sort of buffer group between white Americans on top, Black Americans on the bottom. Of course, we could throw certain Latin American groups in there. We could throw certain pretty much all the Native American groups in there with Black folks at the bottom. But if you start to go within, certainly within Blacks, and this is why I said certain Latinx groups, you find that there is a long history of there being a buffer group phenomenon. And so if you look, for example, at I wrote this in the chat box, maybe I want to copy and paste this stuff. They were known as the gens de couleur. These are the free Blacks of what was the Louisiana Purchase territories, right? So from New Orleans all the way up to Chicago, because the French colonization policy dealt with race a little differently, you had a large number of free Blacks. Typically, they were of mixed European and African heritage, but they very much represented the same kind of buffer group that could only attain but so high. Their position was always vulnerable to the whims of whatever, but they could be middle class, they could be property, they could get schooling, and this persisted after I don't know how that wind is blowing in my mic. After the French were ousted in the Anglicization of that territory begins, it will go on for a very long time that you have this group of Blacks who have always had access to better education. They've had, money. They have certain types of social capital in the family, but they were still limited by the realities of race, right? And that's essentially what you're saying about the bulk of the Asian groups that we're talking about. You can reach a certain height, but generally you're going to be limited by the realities of racial stratification that will keep white Americans will continue to change the rules en masse to be able to stay at the top. So how meritocracy is actually going to be playing out in the most selective spaces, ultimately you're going to get pushed back, and where people can keep a group that's proving to be very successful on one set of criteria, they'll look at a different set of criteria and say, yeah, but not good enough here. So I think it's all very, very helpful. Thank you for inviting me. I brought a colleague, Mona Khalil. Mona should feel free if you have any thoughts or questions. But thank you, Ying. This is very, very helpful.
Thank you, Bilal. So full disclosure, Bilal and I were graduate school buddies. So we were actually graduating both from Johns Hopkins sociology. And thank you for your support and feedback. I very much agree with you that about this parallel to Jew. And that's why there is a couple of slides I didn't really show to you that Asian Americans college admission controversy. So there has been very high profile lawsuit about Asian Americans being presumably discriminated in selective college admissions. And this is very much similar to what happened to Jew, right? Actually, this so-called holistic admissions policy that most American universities are, I've spent quite a bit of time writing about holistic admission in my book, comparing American college admissions with Chinese college admissions. Actually, the holistic admissions are very much generated out of trying to exclude or limiting Jewish students at Harvard, because of this extremely high representation of Jewish students, and based on the previous admissions policy, very much similar to what is the Chinese education system now on test scores. There are a lot of Jewish students out there, and they want to limit Jewish students. So they have this holistic admissions, so-called well-roundedness. We need to look at your extracurricular activities. We need to look at athletics. We need to look at all these other aspects that Jewish students seems to be not so good at, and other white students are. They play sports. They they do all kinds of other non-academic stuff. So yes, that's why people are wondering, are Asian Americans new Jews in America? And I don't think so. They share some similarities, but they differ in key aspects, which is skin color, race. And we all know that race is a master status in American society. And so that alone would not really make Asian Americans Jew. So that's my response. And to some extent, I would imagine the barriers for Asian Americans, because of the skin color, they're not whites, should be more challenging. It should be more hard. It should be harder to overcome than what Jewish people have encountered. And even nowadays, there is a lot of anti-Semitism. Jewish people are still experience racism and so on and so forth. But what Asian Americans anticipating and have experienced is more than that because of race. And I agree with you that, Bilal, there is always this buffer category. There's this middleman, middleman minority, and so the racial triangle slides is just a very heuristic kinds of a picture, simplified picture to really show you. But I think that triangle is one thing. The other thing is they have this different axis. So one is this sort of this racial hierarchy that we all are aware. The other is this horizontal dimension, which is about civic ostracism. So in other words, Asian Americans have this very, very complex and sometimes contradictory status in the United States. So on one hand, they're rated very high at the structural level. On the other hand, they're rated very low to some extent at the cultural level. They're not really perceived as warm. They're not really perceived as patriotic. They're perceived as being the outsider. That's a big thing. If you're perceived as outsider, how can you lead people, right? So I think that's really the fundamental knot here in terms of bamboo ceiling. So to really improve on the front of bamboo ceiling, having more Asian American representation at the top leadership level, I think we have to overcome civic ostracism. We have to make Asian Americans much more visible in popular culture. We have to make that happen. We have to have serious conversations and trainings, which I think Mona and Bilal's your company has done so well off. But we need to really include Asian Americans. I think the very fact that Asian Americans are outside of the conversation is a big issue here. They're not even counted. I mean, I am in higher education. I know more than anyone else that Asian Americans are not really counted as underrepresented at all levels because they're not underrepresented. People would just say they're not underrepresented. So we have to take this underrepresentation, overrepresentation issue at a more nuanced level. Thank you.
Thanks so much for that response. This is a great discussion. If anyone else would like to ask another question.
You want to ask a tough question if no one else has one?
You always challenging me, Bilal. Please go ahead.
This might actually be one that everybody wants to hear. So the last year of Asian American violence anti-Asian American violence has culminated in some actual media attention, right? And visibly anyway, perhaps some new levels of organizing from within Asian American community. My question for you is, how successful do you think this organizing will be in undermining the anti-Asian animus that's in American society?
Good question. Thank you for that. I think it's pretty successful. It's probably the most successful I have seen over the past two decades of my living in this country. So it's not just, I think they get organized, not just responding to anti-Asian racism. I think they get organized. I'm so happy to see that they're getting organized to join Black Lives Matter movement, for example, especially for second generation. I've seen a broad coalition of solidarity built. I don't really see that, before the last year. So I think getting organized, speaking out and speaking up against what happened to them as a community is very important. Building coalition and solidarity with other communities, such as African Americans, such as Latinos, such as other undocumented immigrants. Oh, 1 in 7 Asian Americans we have not mentioned are undocumented immigrants. People don't talk about it. So in New York City, for example, there is this a research team studying undocumented immigrants, and there is a visible focus on Asian undocumented immigrants. So if people can really build solidarities and coalitions with other minorities, I think that's gonna make model minority myth, most likely to go away, because model minority myth is powerful only to be used as a wedge issue to divide minorities. If minorities come together and build coalitions and solidarities, I think model minorities will lose its currency and validity and power. Only if they're divided they can be used, right?
That's it. I will chime on that one. The coalition building, because the Asian Americans I spend the most time around are South Asian and Southwest Asian, which we don't call Southwest Asian. We tend to call quote unquote Middle Eastern. The struggle around coalition building will be this: where do you live? The residential choices and the schooling choices are the big wedge issue, if you will, for folks, well-meaning folks on both sides who want to end the sort of history of division, the intra-minority wars, if you will. That, for example, just among Muslim Americans, there's a huge divide that persists between Black Americans from the slavery Jim Crow experience, and even it's hard to say what percentage, but a decent number of Black folks who immigrate from elsewhere more recently. There's a split where some land on the kind of more on the Black American side, some land more on the not really dealing with you people side. But because people can use the affluence that's generated by more success in the schooling track that gets you professional jobs, then you can live in communities that look very different from where the bulk of Black Americans have to live, which I say have to live because wherever we move, 20 years later, we're right back where we started, even if we left a, sort of war-torn Black American neighborhood because of white flight. And so it's really going to be that fundamental shifting of how race plays out in residential and educational markets in this country that will change the game. And that's the hardest one to crack because people feel like they're sacrificing their children to do it.
Yes, actually, I was just about to talk about this subject. So when Bilal, you're talking about this division among Black communities, there is a division among Asian American communities across ethnic groups as well as intergenerationally. I want to talk about intergenerational division first. First generation Asian Americans and second generation Asian Americans, for example, they have very different, oftentimes, positions on affirmative action. This lawsuit driving the college admissions are oftentimes driven by first generation Asian immigrants. And if you're looking at the survey data, there is an Asian American national survey data on their attitudes towards affirmative action. This is actually a very divisive issue. East Asian first generation have the highest percentage of going against, sort of opposing affirmative action. South Asian have the lowest. And the second generation are much more likely to support affirmative action than their parents' generation. Okay, so and this is just one issue. There is a cultural wars within Asian American community as well. Their positions towards LGBTQ, their positions towards Obama's bathroom transgender bill, all those kinds of things. I think generational differences are huge among Asian American communities. And we need to have conversations about it, because if you are divided, it's very hard to build communities and solidarities. And to understand generational differences is important to really bring their home country systems and cultures into perspectives. Why East Asian first generation? If you're looking at New York Times articles about this Asian American coalition, they have education foundation, the first generation, oftentimes dominated by East Asian first generation immigrant, because they oftentimes receive their education in their home country, in China, South Korea, for example. And they have very different educational system based on test scores. So they feel affirmative action is grossly unfair. Because of those cultural backgrounds, those educational systems, they cannot appreciate the diverse, the DEI effort in this country. They think it's injustice, it's unfair. So, but the second generation, because of their American schooling, American education, their exposure to American society, which includes, you know, multicultural communities and ethno-racial groups, that is very different realities of their parents. So they actually understand and support a lot more of affirmative action than their parents' generation. So that's, you know, because I'm a sociologist, I'm a researcher, I understand these issues, and ordinary Americans don't. But we can have conversations, and only by having the conversations across different generations, understanding their differences, can we really build communities and solidarities.
Thank you so much. Sorry, I think we're coming to our sort of time slot limit, and I would like to thank you so much, Professor Ma, for this amazing presentation and all the discussion that we've had surrounding it. I think a lot of these things are, you know, more deeply than scratching the surface of things that we kind of glaze over in the education sphere. And so I really appreciate, like you were saying, the nuances that you're bringing up to the topic of Asian Americans in, you know, higher education and just generally in the workplace in America. So I'd like to, with that, bring this to a close. And thank you everyone for tuning in and for staying to the end. And yeah, with that, we'd like to just thank you for coming, and we hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming and engaging in this very important topic. And I'm actually so glad that, you know, your organization have devoted to this issue, because I think your generation will be futures movers and shakers, and, you know, being aware of those issues are so important, not only for your career but also for our future. And thanks, Bilal, your comments. Yes, I love to be the bridge builder, and that's really my passion. And thank you so much for coming, and wonderful questions. Really enjoy the interaction. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ma.
Thanks.
Great night, everyone.